On episode 85 of the Meat Mafia podcast, we had on Dr. Stephan Van Vliet. Dr. Van Vliet holds a PhD in Kinesiology and Community Health, and now he's focusing most of his attention on agricultural practices as they relate to human health. He's uncovering some of the most forward-thinking research as it relates to creating a more robust food system. And in our conversation with Stephan, we talked about understanding nutrient absorption in the body, including animal foods for muscle protein synthesis, analyzing the nutrients in plant-based beef versus beef, learning the benefits of eating grass-fed beef over grain-fed, explaining the differences between omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids, and breaking down the complementary nutrient profiles between plant and animal-based foods. If you're looking for a deep dive into nutrition and human health and how agricultural practices relate to both of those, this is the episode for you, so sit back and enjoy. This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Equip Foods. Equip provides a complete source of grass-fed beef protein with no added chemicals, fillers, binding agents, or artificial coloring or sweeteners. If you're familiar with the supplement industry, you know that most supplements are loaded with ingredients that you can't even pronounce. Equip's Unflavored Prime has one single ingredient derived directly from grass-fed beef protein. For purists like ourselves who try to only consume balanced, real sources of nutrition, this protein powder checks all the boxes. Go check them out in the link below and use our promo code in the description to get a discount. We get questions all the time about how to incorporate beef liver into a healthy, balanced diet. The questions are usually around how to source high-quality beef liver, how to overcome the taste of liver, and how to travel and still be able to include beef liver into your diet. That's why we love Optimal Carnivore, which provides beef liver supplements as well as an organ complex for people to incorporate beef liver without the taste and with the convenience of just being able to pack it into a bag and toss it into your mouth when you're ready for your supplements. Beef liver is an important part of my diet because it provides me with the B12, copper, vitamin A that you can't really get from any other food groups. Beef liver is truly nature's vitamin, and being able to incorporate it in such an easy form, such as this supplement, makes it that much better. Go check out Optimal Carnivore and let us know what you think. Stephan Van Vliet, welcome to the Meat Mafia podcast. I feel like this has been a long time coming, and we are beyond excited to have you.
Yeah, no, great. Thanks for having me, guys. I'm excited to be here and dive in some of the topics.
I think this is the most excited I've ever seen Harry to having a podcast guest on, Stephan, so you should be honored by that.
That's great. If this is his most exciting self, you probably don't get excited very quickly.
Well, we failed to mention before we started the podcast that I lived over in Amsterdam for a little bit, so I have a certain epiphany for the Dutch culture, and I was excited to hear that you were from. I think you're from Rotterdam, correct?
Yeah, that's right, from Rotterdam. So technically, we don't like Amsterdam, but that's right. There's at least a big soccer rivalry between Rotterdam and Amsterdam. But no, it's I'm from the Netherlands. I grew up there, Rotterdam, and it was nice place to grow up for sure.
Yeah, it's an incredible country. We're really excited to dive in and learn a little bit more about what you're up to at Utah State, but maybe just to kind of set the stage and give some context around your background, if you wouldn't mind just diving in and giving us some of the background that led you to Utah State.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in the Netherlands, and close to the city, but also close to agricultural land. So I always get food at farmers markets and I get dairy from local farmers. So I was able to always have an interest in that. And then I, as with most people, when they're like 16, 18 years old, I didn't really know what I wanted to do in life. So I got a degree in business administration. But then during my undergrad, I really got interested also in lifting weights and nutrition and performance and things like that. So then I figured out that you could actually probably, make a career in that. And so I went to school in England in a small teaching school, did my master's there in exercise and nutrition science. At least I was able to have the credentials. Then I did an internship at a muscle biology or physiology lab at Maastricht, a stable isotope lab. So we're studying a lot of muscle protein synthesis and how different food sources such as beef and dairy and also plant proteins would impact our muscle protein synthetic response. So they're building muscle proteins, oftentimes in response to exercise, but also in older individuals. Then I was able to, a person who was doing his postdoc there, he was from the US. He got a position at University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. So I did my PhD there for 4 years. Again, a lot of muscle physiology, muscle biology work, also human nutrition work. So we're always studying how different protein sources impact the muscle protein synthetic response. And we found this a couple of unusual findings, at least at that time, because at the time it was thought amino acids are key when it comes to protein sources, and they are dictating the response. Well, they are to a large extent, but also the sort of the bioactive compounds that you find in food, such as egg yolks, dairy, right? They have the dairy matrix, or the whole food matrix, as you call them. Well, those bioactive compounds, vitamins, minerals, and bioactive compounds refers to this whole other array of nutrients that impact our health and metabolism. Well, we found a role for those too in impacting protein synthesis. We did this interesting study where we compared egg whites and whole eggs matched for protein. They are nearly identical on their amino acid profile too, but the whole eggs gave a higher muscle anabolic response, which maybe it makes sense because, you know, a baby can grow out of that, right? So it has some stuff in there that can drive growth. And as I got through further into my career, I did postdocs at the WashU School of Medicine, at Duke University School of Medicine. I got interested in, well, what are the ways to improve people's health, of course, but improve the nutrient density or these bioactive compounds in foods. And that's where I sort of also started to turn more towards agriculture too. And the last few years really have been working at the nexus of agriculture, human health. So do more sustainable agricultural practices. How do they impact the nutrient density of foods? And then we run several randomized controlled trials also to look at the effect on human health. And so that's what led me to this path at the Center for Human Nutrition Studies at Utah State now.
That's an amazing overview. I think one of the things that we really wanted to ask you based on your story is, when did the light bulb start to go off in your head that animal products were some of the most nutrient dense foods that you could actually put into your body?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if there was a light bulb moment. When I went to school 10 years ago, I mean, we get nutritional biochemistry and you know, advanced nutrition and things like that, right? And then you sort of learn also that animal source foods are good sources of these nutrients, plant sources are maybe good source of these nutrients, and sort of taken together, they typically, you know, you provide for a complete nutritional profile. And of course, there's nuances in it and overlaps and things like that, but that's really where sort of the interest started. And they also, growing up, I grew up in the Netherlands, we're very heavy dairy consumers, and oftentimes thought that's why we're so tall, because we didn't used to be this tall. And especially the last sort of 150 years, we've grown to the tallest people in the world. So yeah, it was always, you know, I grew up drinking unpasteurized milk and things like that, which it's, God forbid you do so in the US, which is, it's interesting, right? I can go get a pack of cigarettes from the local store right now, but that's against the law. But so that's interesting, certainly interesting perspective. But no, so I you know, grew up eating cheeses and dairy, and so I've always thought of animal source foods as sort of a component of the diet. And then as I started to do more of this nutrition research, especially when we're doing comparing plant protein rich sources or animal source foods, you could see indeed a higher anabolic response at these more moderate intakes. And also, just like I'm trained as a muscle biologist or a physiologist, and we are also oftentimes studying human muscle, and sort of using that same kind of research technique, we also study animal source foods or plant source foods. And what we're seeing is that when you really dig deep, look at hundreds of compounds in a food source, then yeah, I mean, plant sources and animal sources, while they can both be nutrient dense, they are very much different. And the combination of those, to me at least, seems like an optimal thing to do. And of course, there's, you know, and I'm talking here like painting with broad strokes, of course, like most people probably fall on the spectrum of omnivory. Some people might do very well on vegan diets or plant exclusive diets. Other people, clearly, although we need more research, but anecdotally, people, you know, are on animal-based diets for prolonged periods of time, and their health seems to be improving and then doing well. So, but yeah, that's really where my interest started, and why we started to look at sort of sustainable agriculture and sort of livestock is that because there's so much of concern about this too. And even when I wrote some of the papers like 7-8 years ago, if you wrote about animal sourced foods, like sustainability was a little bit of a consideration, but nowadays you cannot almost not talk about animal sourced foods anymore and put it into like the sustainability and nutrition standpoint. So that's really where the interest came from, also to look at animal source food specifically, like because there's a lot of concern there, and that's probably where we could make some strides, some improvements, hopefully.
It's fascinating because there's kind of two parts to it. There's the part where it's the production side, so maybe like a cow versus another cow, that can be completely different nutrient profiles, but then there's how your body actually reacts to two different food sources and like the absorption of the nutrients that occurs once it enters your body. Is there anything that you found to be surprising about nutrient absorption between different types of foods?
Yeah, well, we did some profiling, especially when we looked at sort of the whole food matrix. Once we started, so protein synthesis, muscle protein synthesis has predominantly been studied in response to protein shakes, essentially. So whey protein, casein protein, soy protein, all protein isolates. Once we started to feed whole food sources of protein, this is beef, eggs, dairy. What was interesting there is that you really start to modify the muscle protein synthetic response that is not predicted by the amino acids alone. So that's where sort of I got this healthy appreciation of the whole food matrix. So that was very interesting. And as I got deeper into my career and we started to use food metabolomics. So what metabolomics essentially is a study of metabolites. Metabolites are intermediates of end products of metabolism, where it being the metabolism of plants or animals or soils for that matter. Not all metabolites are nutrients, but certainly all nutrients are metabolites. So obviously a plant, it produces various metabolites, but the plant doesn't produce those for us, of course. The same with the animal, right? It produces for its own health, but from some of these metabolites we can obtain nutritive value. So when we start to really dig deep into those, what you find is that what you feed an animal or how you raise a plant, monoculture or biodiversity, can really impact these metabolites, these nutrients in the plant, and it can also impact, obviously, the nutrients and the metabolites in the animal, where you see this connection between animal health and nutrient density, which obviously makes sense. So those were really interesting findings, is that, you can really sort of the statement, you are what you eat, to an extent is true, and also for animals, right? And in humans too. I mean, some of the very elegant work out of Israel found that about 50% what circulates in our blood is directly related to the foods that we eat, more so than anything else. What circulates in our blood is determined by our food. So even exercise, the microbiome, sleep, all had a much lower impact. And so that's really interesting. And translating that back to sort of the animal, what you feed the animal also largely impacts the nutritional profile. So those were some really interesting findings, that you see this transfer from these nutrients from the forages into the animal, and that you can really trace those, and then trace those all the way into the human as well.
So it sounds like it's not just you are what you eat, you are what your food eats. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. You are what you eats. It's very much true. And how you raise or feed, what you feed an animal or how you raise it, does have a big impact on the health of the animal, but then also the nutrients that you find in there. We've been doing a lot of profiling of beef from different production systems. And what was really interesting and sort of eye-opening to me too is that, like I said, I was trained as a human physiologist or a muscle biologist, and we were doing muscle biopsies on people. So you would take a small piece of muscle from a human, and we did that on endurance trained athletes, strength trained athletes, but also people with metabolic syndrome. And we use these analytical techniques, and you can say something about the health of the person or its metabolism based on the muscle. The muscle is the largest organ in our body. It gives a good indicator of sort of overall health in our bodies. When we do these similar analysis on cattle from different production systems, you see these parallels where the animals that have plenty of ability to engage in physical activity on pasture, walk a couple of miles a day, versus maybe an animal that is unable to walk a lot in the feedlot. So you get this exercise component. They start to look like endurance trained athletes, like human endurance trained athletes. So it's really interesting to see sort of this shared phenotype across mammalian species, right? Because when we profile the muscle of animals or the muscle of humans, we like to think we're very different, but sort of on a molecular level, we're not that different. If you look at mitochondria or like glucose metabolism or, some of these other fatty acid metabolites and carnitines, that really gives us a good indicator of the health. And so it's super interesting to see that you get this athletic phenotype in the cattle on pasture and sort of like this early metabolic syndrome like phenotype, where it definitely, as compared to grass-fed cattle, you see that the grain-fed cattle look a bit unhealthier. I don't want to say that grain-fed meat therefore is unhealthy per se, because I think many randomized controlled trials suggest that overall diet quality is what matters, and if you eat grain-fed meat as part of like a healthy diet, you still get healthy outcomes, right? Like studies with the Mediterranean diet or beef plus dash diet, beef plus bolt diet, and things like that. But it is interesting that you see these parallels between humans and cattle and other animals too, where I see improvements in mitochondria, improvements in glucose metabolism, much like you would see in an endurance strength athlete or a healthy human. So that's been also, I must say, one of the more eye-opening parts of the research that we've been doing over the last few years. And it kind of makes sense if you think about it, right? Like if in humans we see these differences with people that are physically active, eat healthy diets, why would we not expect to see the similar differences in across other species, right? So that's been certainly interesting to look at.
Have you guys been able to quantify that difference between grass-fed cattle and grain-fed cattle?
Yeah, we are. Yeah, we are. We're actually having a big project going on now. We dubbed it the Beef Nutrient Density Project. It's a collaboration with the Bionutrient Institute. And we are recruiting 250 farms all across the US. Anything from sort of rotationally grazed, regenerative, as the farmers usually call it, regenerative grass-fed, to feedlot finished, and sort of anything in between. Because certainly I want to highlight is that, feedlot beef isn't feedlot beef either. If we worked with like some smaller or some more artisanal feedlots that have an enriched environment, you definitely see a difference versus some other systems. And even amongst grass-fed, it's like monoculture of pasture does not provide the same nutrient density as a very biodiverse pasture, when the animals are grazing 20 or 50 different plants versus a few dominant plants. So what we're typically seeing, if we look at these phytochemicals or antioxidants, they're about threefold higher in grass-fed versus grain-fed, and then monoculture kind of falls in the middle. But some of the individual compounds like quercetin, which is well known to occur in onions, chlorogenic acid, which is in coffee, for instance. If we look at some of those, we've had sort of broadly in our database now, we see that, for instance, I think it's quercetin and quinate, which is also another phytochemical, they're like 70, 80-fold higher in grass-fed beef versus grain-fed beef, because they're grazing phytochemically rich plants that have a lot of these phytochemicals in there. And then some other interesting findings are also, of course, the omega-3s are higher in grass-fed beef. But this was interesting, and again, it's one of those things that after the fact makes total sense. Saturated fat, right, is we also see these long chain saturated fatty acids becoming enriched much like the polyunsaturated fatty acids. So we think of saturated fat as something that's bad, and we think of this as like this standard category, right? But there is all the way from 4 carbon chains in length to 40. Now we typically don't detect those, but like the ones like C20, C22, like behenic acid, arachidic acid, lignoceric acid. The longer chain ones become enriched in grass-fed beef, but those in epidemiological studies are also associated with a decreased risk of metabolic disease, cancer, or and heart disease and diabetes. So saturated fat isn't saturated fat either, and we see these sort of, at least based on epidemiological research, beneficial saturated fatty acids becoming enriched in grass-fed beef. So, and that's super interesting. And even in sort of a feedlot system, there may be opportunities to feed more phytochemically rich agri-waste and also kind of move the needle on that too, because we probably have both systems realistically. So, sort of finding best practices in that is important. And so that's some of our initial findings. And I'd say that the difference are, so we find a 56 to 60% difference between grass-fed and grain-fed beef, much beyond omega-3 fatty acids. And I think the consumer is kind of underestimating that, to be honest, because you often hear like, oh, there's some difference in omega-3 fatty acids and that's it. But that's not the case. And also, if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, right? On one hand, if we feed a human a Mediterranean diet or a Salmon American diet, and I would ask you guys, well, do you expect a difference in health? Then, your answer would probably be yes, I expect a difference in health. If we feed lab mice 6 weeks on diet A and 6 weeks on diet B, we'd expect a difference. But then in cattle, we don't expect to see a difference. That's kind of unusual, yeah, right? So if you feed grains for 4 months or grass for 4 months, well, we see like similar magnitudes of differences in cattle as we see in lab animals or humans, for that matter.
Wow, that's an amazing point, because we hear this all the time. I think you had mentioned before that there are a lot of nuances to grain finished beef. It also seems like there are a lot of nuances to grass-fed, grass finished beef too, where I don't know what you would do if you don't go directly to your farmer or have a trusted source, because there's so many times where you're in the supermarket and products are being greenwashed as being grass-fed, but the cow is still being finished on like a total mixed ration or finished on grain. And you as the consumer really have no way to verify that unless you actually have access to a farm.
Yeah, no, I could not agree more with that statement. Indeed, it's like usually the farms that are doing, sort of regenerative or sustainable principles, they're also the ones who want to tell you about that and show you, right?
Right.
Go to the farmer's market, or just, like you can just look at Google and find local farmers. And to your point is that we recently did a fatty acid analysis on, I think, and the work is not published yet, but it's a couple of hundred samples. And we did grass-fed, grain-fed. And what was interesting is that some of the grass-fed samples, in terms of their omega-6 to 3 ratio, looked worse than some of the feedlot finished beef. Wow. And they were labeled grass-fed. So the feedlot finished beef then typically has an omega-6 to 3 ratio of about 10 to 1, 12 to 1, 15 to 1. Grass-fed, the farmers that I know and I've been to and I've seen that they did doing the right thing, those guys all have an omega-6 to 3 ratio of like 1.1, 1.5, something like that, or at least below 2 to 1. So there's a lot of omega-3s in there and not a lot of omega-6s. But then there's some beef in the grass-fed beef supply chain that have this omega-6 to 3 ratio of like 10 to 1, which are right on par with beef we know came from a feedlot. So assuming the data doesn't lie, which we can be safely say that it doesn't lie, then I'm like, well, this is supposed to be grass finished, but I don't know. You definitely put grains through this animal. Otherwise, there's no way that the N6 PUFAs are so high in the grass-fed animal. So maybe they're finishing on grass, but maybe they're feeding a bunch of soybean hulls or other things like that, which is not per se a bad thing, but and we can talk about the nuances of that too, because pasture finished with free choice access to grain is something I'm actually quite interested in, because it's a great way of upcycling byproducts, right? That would otherwise go into a landfill. And something I'm very interested in too is agri-waste, it's very common in sort of Southeast Asia or Africa or other sort of those where, for instance, you would feed byproducts from fruit or vegetable industry through animals, right? Like the scraps. This inadvertently, probably without knowing, actually increases the phytochemical richness, because a lot of these fruit and vegetable peels, they're chock full of phytochemicals and antioxidants, and will raise the omega-3 fatty acids, as opposed to like grain byproducts, which is what we're feeding here. But not to say that we cannot feed some grain byproducts, but maybe, you know, doing this on pasture or in limited amounts, or maybe adding some more phytochemically rich fruit and vegetable waste into the total mixed ration and feedlot systems. They're all great opportunities to increase that. But yeah, to your point, it's getting to know your farmer, establishing a relationship with your farmer, and yeah, getting beef from there. That is also what I would, yeah, if you're interested in that, if you're interested in eating grass-fed beef, if you can afford it, I would seek a local reputable source that you kind of know or can feel comfortable that they are doing the right thing, rotational grazing, and, you know, not overgrazing, having biodiverse pastures. But honestly, nowadays with the internet, you can also find many farmers that you can kind of like safely assume that they're doing the right thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Stephan, maybe for our audience's benefit, you mentioned omega-3 to omega-6 ratios. Could you just break that down for like a consumer perspective, just like how people should be thinking about that ratio and why it's important?
Yeah, so absolutely. So omega-3 fatty acids, they're made out of alpha linoleic acid. Then also docosahexaenoic acid, DHA, and you have EPA, which is another omega-3 fatty acid. Those are sometimes dubbed like, you know, the fish oils, omega-3 fatty acids that are very rich in fatty fish, but you can actually also find them in grass-fed beef. And various randomized controlled trials have suggested that you can actually raise the amount of EPA and DHA in your blood with eating grass-fed beef. So, but those are typically associated with improvements in brain health, reduce your risk of cancer, cardiovascular disease, and things like that. So the omega-3 fatty acids and even ALA may have distinct benefits from DHA and EPA. So ALA is the plant precursor to those, but you also find those in higher amounts in grass-fed beef because they're consuming more forages. ALA is also rich in various nuts, for instance, and things like that, and other certain plant oils. Whereas the omega-6 fatty acids, that is where I'd say there's some it's quite controversial, I should say. On one hand, there's something to be said to not overload on omega-6 fatty acids and get some more omega-3s in. I mean, we're certainly under consuming those as US populations. I certainly think that's the case, that we should get our omega-3 intake up. On the other hand, the omega-6, here's where it becomes mixed, because on the one hand, they're more prone to oxidation. They're very rich in seed oils, right? There's a lot of concern about seed oils, although I think the seed oil thing is like conflated with ultra processed foods, much like red meat, right? It's like red meat is sort of deemed the devil or an enemy when it comes to sort of healthy diets. But if you eat red meat as part of a healthy diet, those associations with disease seem to disappear. I also think that some of this with the seed oils, the omega-6, while in certain animal models they seem to be, you know, inducing maybe more inflammation, and it's usually more oxidized versions. But think of it but then you have randomized controlled trials too that feed people canola oil or, you know, any other seed oil, just like for an unprocessed version. And in the randomized controlled trials, they seem to be perfectly fine for health. But here's maybe the caveat: if you put that on a shelf-stable product that's supposed to be on the shelf for 2 years, right? Then maybe in an ultra-processed food, and you do heat treatments and other sort of industrial processes, then yeah, maybe that can become an issue, right? Much like eating sort of processed meat as part of an ultra-processed diet. seed oils or rich in ultra-processed foods. So I think that's also where the concern comes from. But anyway, I'm sort of going down a different route here that we can talk about. But in any case, increasing the omega-3s in the diet is typically good for health. So when we talk about the omega-6 to 3 ratio, we talk about the amount of N6 polyunsaturated fatty acids, the omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids, divided by the omega-3 fatty acids. A ratio closer to 1-to-1 is typically considered like beneficial or sort of the gold standard. Basically, probably in the past, our diets were more, our intakes were more like 3-to-1, 4-to-1. If you look at indigenous populations or historical diets, nowadays, because we consume so many grains and seed oils, it's more like 20-to-1. So that's could be problematic where we have a lot of LA in our diets, right? The omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acid. So having a more favorable omega-6 to 3 ratio, like close to 1-to-1 or 2-to-1, where we have a lot of omega-3s, as we're seeing in grass-fed beef, but also other sources are obviously fatty fish and even pasture-raised eggs can be a good source and things like that. That's typically something that raising the omega-3s in our blood, DHA and EPA, is considered favorable for our health. So when we talk about the omega-6 to 3 ratio, it being lower, than we typically talk about, that's something that's associated with improvements in metabolic health.
Got it. No, that's fantastic. And one of the things you've mentioned a few times is this concept of nutrient density. So for our listeners and for myself, frankly, I was just curious what your definition of nutrient density actually is, and then what animal products or just food products in general do you find to be the most nutrient dense out of everything on your scale?
Yeah, so nutrient density is sort of looking at the amounts of nutrients, typically micronutrients per unit of energy. For instance, that could be or a unit of protein is something we look at too, as sort of like, especially when we talk about protein-rich sources, right? So a given food source like beef might have 20 grams of protein per like 3.5 ounces of product, right? But the micronutrient or the phytochemical profile, if we take the example of like grass-fed and grain-fed beef, the phytochemical profile might be much more nutrient dense in the case that, yes, both contain 20 grams of protein, not a lot of difference in total protein content, but in the grass-fed beef, we're finding that it accumulates more alpha tocopherol, beta carotene, so precursor to vitamin A and vitamin E. It has more niacin, vitamin B3 in there. It has more 2 to 3-fold higher phytochemicals. So while the weight or the protein content or the energy content of these products is similar, there is a lot more of these micronutrients or bioactive compounds in certain sources. So that could be a way of expressing nutrient density, for instance, typically what we do. And the same thing too with a carrot or so. If you have a carrot from an agroecological system versus maybe more of a monoculture, you might see more beta carotene. So a more nutrient dense carrot or more total antioxidants in that carrot, and it may be as much as some studies suggest like 100x, so 100-fold more in carrot A versus carrot B. So a huge variation. So the nutrient density of this carrot B might be much higher than in A. And I mean, the tricky part about nutrient density is that you can come up with a scoring scheme that makes kale look like the most nutrient dense food, or you can come up with a scoring scheme that makes liver the most nutrient dense food. And some people have certainly done that. And I'd say both are very nutrient dense, and typically organ meats, shellfish, fish, eggs, they are amongst the most nutrient dense foods. Things like liver, heart, kidneys, oysters, clams, and things like that in the animal source foods, because they're rich in iron, they're rich in zinc, they're rich in vitamin B12, they're rich in things like B12 vitamins, B vitamins in general. But then you can look at other sources that may be rich in folic acid, that may be rich in pantothenic acid, like vitamin B5, which is typically found in rich in plant-sourced foods. you might find a lot of beta carotene or a lot of like vitamin E precursors in there, alpha tocopherol, beta carotene. So it depends really on your scoring system. But yeah, in the animal source foods, I'd say the organ meats, shellfish, amongst the most nutrient dense that I think people should be selecting or at least incorporating regularly into their diet. And then with plant source foods, I mean, it's again looking at typically dark green leafy vegetables are amongst the most nutrient dense foods, I should say. Yeah.
And is the sorry here, I just one quick point. I was just curious, is the bioavailability of the micronutrients of those dark leafy greens an issue? Like, because I know that's a big thing in the carnivore animal-based community, is just saying how a lot of these cruciferous vegetables don't actually want to get eaten. So just curious your take on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, indeed, they don't want to get eaten, and that's why they have some of these phytochemicals in there, which are sort of safety or ways of deterring us. But since we've been consuming those for a very long time, and sort of same with herbivory, right, where animals, evolved eating those plants. We've been eating plant foods for a very long time as well. Perhaps you could argue before we started eating meat, although meat was very important, obviously, in our evolution. But anyway, having some amounts of these phytochemicals or these compounds, we with proper processing methods, we can digest. And this would be, if you have a green kale smoothie every morning or like a spinach smoothie, then you might be overloading yourself on anti-nutrients, right? But if you cook these properly and process these properly, then you can obtain nutritive value from these, certainly. And of course, people that have maybe some gut dysbiosis or some other gut issues may have trouble digesting these things. And indeed, if you look at, for instance, cabbage, right? Can be difficult to digest if you consume cabbage all the time. It might get some gut issues, but we can make things like sauerkraut out of it, and then it's much easier to digest for us. And the same with a carrot. Like if you cook a carrot, the beta carotene in there becomes about 10-15 times more digestible. So those are also things of like the processing part becomes very important, right? And you can definitely, you obtain nutritive value from both plant and animal source foods. And, animal source foods have more zinc, iron, B12, whereas plant source foods typically higher in thiamine, folic acid, vitamin C. So they have different but potentially complementary nutrient profiles. So that's what I'd say. But I would say sort of the best way to look at that is also try what works best for the person, right? And maybe through different stages of life, you might not be able to consume those foods if you have some gut issues that you need to resolve first. But provided those are resolved, maybe would be my recommendation, or potentially to try to incorporate some of those too. Just knowing what we know about the distinct nutritional profiles of animal and plant source foods. Incorporating both is at least in my perspective, the best way to go. And where you fall on like sort of this animal or plant-based, that can be individual then, right? But to me, it makes most sense to incorporate both, knowing what we know about their different nutritional profiles.
I'm curious to get your take on the third element in the room here, which is the processed foods, and how I feel like labeling can be particularly misleading when it comes to when you're comparing processed foods to real foods. Do you feel the same way? Like when you're looking at processed foods, are those nutrients all really there, and are you absorbing them in the same fashion as you would with real foods?
Yeah, that's a good question. The issue here becomes, and we did an interesting comparison of a plant-based meat alternative and meat. So we looked at the nutrition facts panel. If you look at there's about 13 nutrients that appear: protein, fat, saturated fat, and then a handful of vitamins and minerals, right? The vitamins and minerals in the meat source were part of its natural meat matrix. The plant-based meat alternative had these added as a fortified source. What we typically know, or what we know based on the literature, is that providing nutrients in a sort of whole food matrix is typically better because you have a bunch of cofactors, it is absorbed better, versus maybe sort of synthetic nutrients, right? And because you can sort of match the nutrition facts panel, but you're not matching the hundreds or thousands of other compounds that are in the whole food matrix that can aid in the digestion absorption. Which is, I'm sometimes concerned when people have this overly reductionistic approach and thinking like, well, we just, fortify our food supply with B12 and zinc and iron, and then we'll be fine. Well, we know that's not ideal. There have been even studies done in, where people consumed meat for just meat, and you would get, like the iron, zinc, etc., or supplements that were matched to the same intake of iron and zinc that you get from the meat. Well, at the end of the study, people had better zinc and iron status when it was provided into a whole food matrix rather than in a supplemental form. And you typically see that. I mean, that's sort of the principal units in nutrition, right? There are food sources. We consume foods. We don't consume isolated nutrients because we have these food sources that are very complex. They contain thousands of phytochemicals and then nutrients, micronutrients that interact with each other and ensure proper uptake. Thinking that we can just replicate that in an ultra-processed food and add some supplementary vitamins and minerals in it and thinking we've replicated the food source, that's a ridiculous idea in my opinion, and really overestimates our knowledge of foods, which is very small, I would say. Even our food metabolomics work, if we can detect 1,000 nutrients or 1,000 metabolites, we're lucky. Foods probably contain 40,000 metabolites or maybe 100,000 metabolites, right? So we're scratching the surface, and we don't fully understand it. So I would go for whole food sources and rather than ultra processed foods. And talking about ultra processed foods, it seems like and there's exceptions, of course. People always try to throw exceptions in your face and then say like, well, what about almond milk? That's ultra processed. Yes, almond milk is ultra processed if we look at it, because there's some vitamins and minerals in it, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about here ultra processed foods made out of refined grains, refined oils, refined proteins that bear very little resemblance to sort of the original food that it came out of. And that's where I think we see a lot of the issues. And when it comes to ultra processed foods, I think everyone's eventually run into health issues over time. Everyone sort of loses on ultra processed foods, it seems like.
That's interesting. I know you mentioned too how you grew up drinking raw dairy. We both played sports in college, so it's widely accepted to have protein powder, which is really just whey protein isolate with a bunch of these other artificial ingredients and fillers, and it's all denatured and everything. It's so interesting how it's like we, as a society, we've scorned things like milk, yet we've accepted things like protein powders to be quote unquote healthy, and we just look at the gram of protein and nothing else that goes into it. To your point.
Yeah, no, it's a shame we have this reductionistic approach. And not to say that protein powders are unhealthy per se, but there has been some interesting work done, especially like looking at the soybeans, right? If you eat those, or you have soy protein isolate, and you have several-fold reduction in phytochemicals that you would normally find in if you have like a soybean or maybe you have like young soy pasta, like edamame or something like that. Versus a soy protein isolate, you're really just sort of diluting down the nutrient density. That's essentially what you're doing. And with the ultra processing too, you also end up with less phytochemicals, less antioxidants in the food source. So it is certainly interesting that, but I think as humans, and we always tend to do this, is that we always think we can do it better than nature, right? But by definition, we can't, of course, because we're part of nature. Right, so we cannot do better than nature, and that's something that we need to accept. But I also sometimes think it's interesting when people say something like that. It's like, oh, we're gonna in 10 years from now we will have made something that's better than think of human breast milk, like for instance, right? In the 70s and 80s, where breast milk manufacturers were trying to convince people that the product they made was better than breast milk. If you think about it, it's ridiculous. And we're still kind of doing that with sometimes where we think like, oh, we just replicate the food source and we can make it better. And I think it grossly overestimates our or knowledge about the complexity of whole foods. I mean, I certainly don't have that knowledge. So if anyone else has, please tell me. But we're using 4 different mass specs to profile foods, and I'm nowhere scratching the tip of the iceberg here. So.
Do you have a particular view on raw milk in particular? Because I know it's such a hot button topic, and Brett and I both consume it and think that it's largely villainized for the wrong reasons. But
yeah, I mean, I get the food safety part on like a sort of population-based level, right? I mean, people used to drink raw milk, and then we have sort of start to congregate cattle close to distilleries, right? And then we create something like swill milk, where we've had like waste streams from this distillery industry, and children got sick, and then we started to pasteurize milk. It's happened in Chicago, and we started to pasteurize milk in New York. And of course, then that's a good thing, right? But you have to ask yourself, why do we need to pasteurize milk to begin with? If there's something wrong with that milk, right? And pasteurization is the only way to render it safe. So I get it on sort of a large population-based level, but I also think people should just have the freedom to connect with their local farmer and are able to buy unpasteurized milk. I mean, certainly I do that here in Utah. It's actually legal, so you can just go to your farmer and buy unpasteurized milk and do so on your own yeah, I mean, I'm not worried about it. I'm 35 years old. It's what I drank all my life, and it's sort of I know it's kind of controversial sometimes as a nutrition professor that you're like a raw milk or something, but anyway, yeah, I think you should have that the ability to do so, and but yeah, just again make sure it's from a farmer that you feel like you could trust,
right.
And that the animals are well taken care of, that the farmer uses, because a lot of it may not even be the animal. It might just be like the farmer not using hygienic practices too, right? That's what a lot of the introduction can come from too. So just making sure that that's the case. But yeah, I mean, if I can walk through my gas station and buy a pack of cigarettes and I cannot get unpasteurized milk, that seems like a kind of a funny thing to me. And the funny thing also to tell is like a little side story. In Europe, especially in France and the Netherlands, pasteurizing our dairy to make cheeses is like blasphemy, right? Wow. Because it's like a lot of these flavor compounds, a lot of these phytochemicals, and studies have shown that you get like this 70% reduction of pasteurization as a result of pasteurization in these phytochemicals and other flavor compounds in the dairy, which is probably also part of the reason why unpasteurized whole milk tastes richer than pasteurized whole milk. Because you have these phytochemicals, these flavor compounds that become denatured, some of these proteins that become denatured. So usually in Europe, there's this saying, like, if you want to win a cheese competition, don't pasteurize your milk.
You probably have an interesting perspective on this. What do you think about the food safety laws between Europe and the US? Is there anything that you think the US does that in particular that or doesn't do that maybe they should be reconsidering?
Yeah, I mean, certainly our food safety laws in the EU are more strict. So we typically tend to be a little bit more cautious on things that we allow, whether that's a good or a bad thing you could argue about, because it makes something maybe more difficult for the food producer. But yeah, in Europe we certainly err on the safe side more so than in the US when it comes to these food safety laws on one hand, right? Well, and I'm talking about this in terms of like added ingredients. Some of the in ultra processed foods, what we allow as far as like color additives or food additives or other preservatives is much more strict in the EU. On the other hand, you could argue that in the EU, what's less strict is something like pasteurization of dairy, where it's much easier to get raw milk. So, I mean, if there's more outbreaks or not, that's another question. But yeah, we typically err on the safe side in the EU more. If you pick up, it's an interesting thing to look at. If you look at mac and cheese from Europe, look at the sort of package. It looks a little bit more artisanal still, and a little less ingredients. Yeah. Whereas in the US, you may need a chemistry degree to understand everything that's in it, right? So, and perhaps many of these things are safe. perhaps some of them can be problematic for some people, or for like the gut microbiome. I mean, that's certainly a question and something to study. I mean, yeah, personally for me, I'd opt for whole foods, and maybe that's European in me, but we're a little erring on the safe side always when it comes to that. So that's why I think, definitely from a European perspective, we throw a lot more additives here in our food supply in the US than we have in Europe. Yeah.
Mm.
Well, you're talking cheese. I don't even think Kraft Singles can call themselves cheese because it's like 51% processed ingredients. So I think legally they can't even they have to label themselves as singles and not cheese. So that perfectly supports what you're saying.
Yeah, cheese products, right?
Cheese products, yeah.
It reminds me of Subway when they had this lawsuit in Ireland, that they had to label it a chicken product rather than chicken, because they use like, I don't know, X% texturized vegetable protein in there. Who's gonna lace their chicken? So yeah,
that's insane. One of the things that I've noticed is that you've cited multiple studies that have really informed your opinion on nutrition, and it made me think how a lot of people that are looking to make sustainable changes, they almost don't know where to start because you're overloaded with information on the internet. You see a study that says red meat is 75% more likely to cause cancer. Maybe that was loosely based off an observational study where the variables are being manipulated. And then, another study, you're hearing how plants are toxic and they don't want to be eaten. I'm just curious your take on, like, when it comes to studies and good data, what kind of things should people be looking for when they're trying to do some of their own research and figure out if a study is actually legitimate or not?
Yeah, the main thing, and it's hard because I understand people don't have a lot of time to read entire studies like someone in my position may be able to do. Also, the accessibility is the issue, right? It's always have it behind a paywall, but yeah, it's reading beyond the abstract really, because you read studies sometimes and you're indeed, like you're mentioning, red meat associated with increased risk of cancer or heart disease or something like that. Then you look at the study and you're like, okay, this was consumed as part of a standard American diet, and even within the study, oftentimes, and people don't even recognize that, is that a study that came out recently on the women was a reanalysis of the Women's Health Initiative, a very classic study done in the US. Red meat associated with increased risk of diabetes, several types of stroke, cardiovascular disease, you name it. It was like 7 conditions they looked at: cancer. When they accounted for sodium intake, BMI, high energy intake, all these associations became neutral. And you often see this in various, there's various studies like that in the literature where either there's extensive adjustment for these other factors, suggesting that it's the high sodium intake, the high energy intake, low fruits vegetable intake, or like high ultra processed food intake in meat-rich dietary patterns that are causing the issue, rather than the red meat per se. Because then if you look at population-based studies where people are consuming red meat as part of Mediterranean diets, as part of that score high on a healthy eating index. Now, a healthy eating index may not be perfect either, because it's sometimes penalized for things that maybe, you're like, I don't know if dietary cholesterol is always per se a bad thing, but okay, we won't go down that road now. But anyway, if you eat red meat as part of some sort of healthy diet, low in ultra-processed foods, rich in fruits and vegetables, you often see these associations with cancer and heart disease. You see these becoming neutral or even becoming protective. Not to say that it's then the red meat that's reducing your risk of cancer. That's not what we're saying, but the overall dietary pattern in which these are consumed matters so much. Unfortunately, usually the headlines don't make these nuances. A better headline would be, eating red meat as part of a standard American diet, rich in ultra-processed foods, high in sodium, high in energy, in people with high BMIs, is associated with increased risk of heart disease. But that doesn't. But maybe when you consume as a part of a healthy diet, or then it's maybe not the case. But that perhaps is not as charming of a headline. But I don't know. But that's usually, so these nuances. Yeah, they're maybe able to pick out as a nutrition researcher, right? But for a consumer, that's very hard. Of course, it would just read the study headline, right? To kind of get after the nitty gritty of that.
With the research that you're doing, when you hear that people start to demonize meat or animal-based products, where does your mind go in terms of like why they're doing that? Like what's their game plan in terms of demonizing red meat in particular?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it depends on the person, of course. If a person doesn't see a role for livestock in our food supply, or considers it unethical to consume animals, I mean, it's perfectly fine. I respect that position. It becomes maybe you could argue whether this is something you can put on entire societies, of course, right? So that could be part of it, and obviously also the issue of like if you focus, there's this very large focus on emissions, right? So if you only look at emissions, you can convince yourself that grass-fed beef is the absolute worst thing to consume, right? Which you kind of miss a lot of nuances then. And let's say if you have a spreadsheet and you have one tab that says emissions, then you could convince yourself that grass-fed beef is way worse than confined chicken, right? But then if you had more tabs in your Excel spreadsheet that says something about water quality, biodiversity, maybe integrated crop livestock systems, circularity of like economies and things like that, then maybe the picture becomes a little bit different. But we just have this enormous focus on emissions, and as a result, right, it's like if you look at emissions only, then I mean, beef is the absolute worst thing that you can consume. But it doesn't make sense to only look at emissions and not the carbon sequestration potential. Let's say if you look at your income statement, right? If you only look at your income but not your expenses, that doesn't make any sense.
Right.
And I think that's something important to consider too when we look at livestock systems, whether like what's the accessibility and the affordability, indeed, especially in the global south where livestock plays an important role in household economies, food security, and things like that. Those are to consider. But even here in the US, right, like more than 20% of women have either one or two micronutrient deficiencies. Women of childbearing age, oftentimes being zinc and iron, right, and which are very rich in animal sourced foods. This is something that has been rising over time, and again, I have a strong preference that we consume those from whole food sources rather than just supplemental iron or zinc, and very better accessibility and bioavailability when we consume from animal source foods versus legumes or plants. So I think those are all important things that we consider, sort of like having this systems perspective on how to approach this. But I think that's where a lot of the pushback is coming from now. And I mean, granted, is that we did move towards this very heavy sort of, confined, industrialized food system, whether it be plants or animals. And I think that's what people are pushing back against too, right? Is that if we, we're all used agroecology more in our livestock systems, then maybe we wouldn't have all these concerns about red meat associating with metabolic disease because we're eating standard American diets and maybe not as good as the quality of meat that we could be eating. And then also, if we didn't go towards these monocultures in plant and animal agriculture, then maybe there wouldn't be as much concern about that now either, right? So so there's something to be said about where we've sort of set ourselves up for that type of system that people are pushing back against. But I think the answer is to use agroecological practices. Agroecology is basically the integration of trees, crop, livestock systems where possible, nature. So it's just nature-based farming solutions where actually I think sort of integrated crop livestock, or maybe well-managed livestock with sort of wildlife habitat, as we're doing here on the Western rangelands. Like, one thing to know is like 2 weeks ago, I don't know if you're familiar with Glenn Alzinga from Alder Spring Ranch.
No.
Okay, he has this, he raises public rangelands up here in Idaho. It's usually super controversial, but when he took control of some of that land, he has seen there were no beavers. Now you've seen 15 beaver colonies. You've seen more wildlife return, a lot of biodiversity return. So there is ways of obviously doing it right and probably doing it wrong, right? And sort of these agroecological methods where we can integrate this with wildlife, and where we can integrate with crops and livestock, probably more in the east of the country. Those are all, I think, things we should be looking at, and that's probably things we should focus more on rather than sort of this, I think, idea of like, let's abolish livestock agriculture. I mean, there's two things you can do when you do something wrong. You can either get rid of it or you can try to improve it. And I think we should try to improve it. And that's more realistic and more feasible and compatible with sort of our omnivorous nature and our cultural traditions.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask, how do you feel about our ability to scale those mechanisms of agriculture that are more sustainable and better for people in general?
I think we can scale it up a lot more. I mean, there just needs to be the incentive to do so.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's slowly coming now, the incentive I mean, we're trying to scale it up in my home country of the Netherlands. And it's also unfortunate because a lot of the pushback that you see there is sort of like against the industrial intensive animal agriculture. And our Dutch government's trying to stimulate getting animals out on the land again, integrating it with crop livestock systems, and having sort of circularity in there. Like if farmer A grows grains, rather than putting those into a landfill, we have to get those integrated with animals again. So getting some of those things scaled up, I think, should be the way to go in the future. If that means that we'll be consuming less animal sourced foods, then if that's where the chips fall where they may, right? But again, it's tricky because there have been analysis done on that, but it also sort of assumes the status quo. But again, coming back to the farmer, he has been increasing, and we see this more, like guys who are increasing their stocking density 3-4 fold because they see more forages return, because they're well managing the land, soil health improves, plant biodiversity improves, and as a result, they can run more animals without overgrazing. So there's also ways of upscaling that in there. Some of them have like 3-4 fold higher amounts of stocking density as a result. So 4 times more meat produced in a given acreage. Right. Other opportunities that we're very interested in, and again, we've created these giant monocultures in agriculture, right? But integrated crop livestock systems. Studies have been done in the 80s and 90s suggesting that, okay, let's say we have a pasture. We split it in half, put sheep on one side and cattle on the other side, and measure their productivity. So that will be the amount of meat produced per given acreage. If you actually integrate those two together, you have a synergistic effect where you can produce more meat on a given acreage. If we then also can somehow integrate this with crop agriculture, right? Then we're stacking multiple enterprises on top of each other on a given land. So, and that's oftentimes not always what we I think consider in upscaling this. So I'd say that sort of we're at this point where, I think we should go more towards agroecology and trying to scale that up. And certainly it seems from based on the literature and on some of these analyses, and no one has a glass bowl either, right? All we can do is model it and see if this works. But the model oftentimes assumes the status quo, whereas we can probably increase. There's plenty of room to increase productivity because we're also wasting a bunch of, as we talked about earlier, fruits and vegetable, phytochemically rich agri-waste that we're wasting. One thing, for instance, let's take the example here. When I was in North Carolina, I was really interested, and unfortunately I wasn't able to do the project, but what if the grape industry is a huge industry, right? About 75% of the grape is used for winemaking. The other 25% can be used to feed the chickens, to pigs, to cattle, potentially. We're not doing that right now, right? A lot of it is just going into landfills. A lot of it is being wasted. So those are things. The cherry industry in Michigan, like feeding some of those byproducts could be a very good, or even like in Florida, feeding more orange peel waste and things like that from the fruit juice industry. Those are all opportunities that we could do. And of course, and that's great what they're doing in California, right? Where it's like a big almond industry trying to feed some of these almond byproducts to cattle and things like that. But I think we can do a lot more of that. And how much more we can upscale that it has to be incentivized, right? Has to come out of the government, these things. But those opportunities, they do seem to be able to upscale the agroecology and sustainable agriculture, where we could have potentially more animals on the land that way, or even if they are confined, using more of these byproducts that we know can increase the nutrient density of the meat, of the milk.
It makes you wonder how some of these big four packers would respond to the concept of transitioning to some of these agroecological practices. You know, are there certain studies or data points that would almost influence them to understand that the productivity of their farm or their operation would be greater by implementing this, as opposed to the conventional model that they've been doing for the last few decades? I don't know what the answer is, but it's just interesting.
Yeah, I mean, and it made total sense in the 60s and 70s after the Green Revolution, right? We had food shortages, specialization was the key. Could produce a lot of food, and that then became the dominant model, right? But if doing the right thing becomes the most profitable thing too at some point, then I think we're in really good shape. And so on one hand, you could say, you know, like, oh, blame the corporations, but I think that's too simple. I mean, they're just also protecting their bottom line, right? But if they're if they're incentivized to do these to implement these agroecological practices, and you see a company like General Mills doing that now, right, with some of their plant agriculture, their oats and other crops, where they are implementing these practices. And I think that is the right thing to do, because maybe in 10, 20 years from now, you'll have a leg up on your competitors, because it's part of climate smart agriculture, and sustainability is going to grow and grow. People are going to become more aware of it, right? So that's a way of sort of making the right thing the most profitable thing, and everyone would do it tomorrow, of course, right? So, and it is certainly something that even big meat packers, I mean, most of them have a grass-fed division too, right? As that starts to grow, then yeah, of course, there's going to be further interest in that, and even with other producers as well. So I think it's on the radar, but also as a company, yeah, you gotta protect your bottom line, right? So, and that becomes then sort of on a government level, where you can incentivize those type of practices, and then sort of get industry on board, and they'll move with. But it has to come out of the consumer, it has to come out of the government.
Are there any farms that you consider kind of the gold standard of how they're operating things and how they're doing things?
Yeah, I must say, many of the farms that we visited, so we visited all the Spring Ranch here in Idaho. I visited a BDA farm in Alabama, visited various like Hickory Nut Gap and the Savory Hub in North Carolina, various farms. And I could name probably another 10, 20 farms on Gabe Brown's farm. But typically, and also in our beef nutrient density project, we're inviting farmers to send in samples. And the farmers that are very eager to send in samples are always the farmers that use, you know, quote unquote, what they describe regenerative practices. Then we're studying their meat. And then indeed, it's like, oh, yeah, you guys have an omega-6 to 3 ratio of 1.1 or 1.2, right? Like the best ratios are found in the farmers that are eager to send in their samples, because they think they're doing the right thing. And as it turns out, they also produce the more nutrient-dense meat, because that's, you know, they're really in tune with what they're doing. If we buy grass-fed beef off the store, that's off the shelf, right? That's where we find these omega-6 to 3 ratios, sometimes of like 7 to 1, 8 to 1, because there's not a strong regulation on verifying that grass-fed labeling. And this may come from systems that are, you know, either feeding off only alfalfa and sort of like a more of a feedlot type system, which is common in grass-fed dairy, right? People buy their grass-fed milk at their and it's certainly not all of them, but there is definitely some grass-fed milk producers or on the market that is coming from sort of like more of a feedlot type, where they feed like, you know, dried hay, alfalfa pellets and things like that. That's not what the consumer thinks when they buy organic milk, right? Or grass-fed milk. It's been out on pasture. So, so you do see that the farmers that are doing the right thing, that think they're doing the right thing, they typically are also amongst the most nutrient-dense meat and the best omega-6 to 3 ratios. So. So it's part of its accountability too, I think, right? Is that if you sort of get that data out there, and it's like, okay, let's clean up our act and try to strive for the best, whether this is in a grass-fed system or in a feedlot system as well, where sort of uphold the best practices in both.
That's where California is very interesting when it comes to raw milk. So I'm in San Diego right now, and raw milk is technically legal. Harry and I were just talking about this the other day, but there's 2 farms that have scale to basically be in every single Sprouts grocery store in California. One is called Raw Farm, and the second is called Claravale. And I'm not trying to say anything bad about them, but I'm just saying, what scale and capacity must those farms be for them to supply the entire Sprouts in California with their product? So, and I think there have been some instances of them using, like, I think they feed their cows cornmeal. So even though you're getting this quote unquote raw milk, I'd be curious how nutrient dense it actually is, because they're not finishing them on grass or anything like that, feeding them
Yeah,
grass.
I can attest to that. So we, and I obviously won't name the sort of aggregator or producer, but so we analyze samples from indeed an aggregator, just like you said, on only then on the grass-fed beef side. So, you know, if you have a big wholesale where you select samples from many different farms, it's sometimes hard to control that quality. It's amongst those big sort of, you know, wholesale of grass-fed beef that you see sometimes very good omega-6 to 3 ratios, but you also sometimes get these like 8-to-1, 10-to-1, where you're like, oh, someone in your supply chain is clearly not feeding grass. I don't know if you know it as the company, probably not, but they're definitely not feeding only grass or things like that. So, and then also maybe the phytochemical richness is not as good. So yeah, I can appreciate that, and I also understand the difficulty, because the companies are obviously, you know, in itself, I mean, of course, trying to make money, but okay, you know, they're trying to get healthy, nutritious milk in people's shelves. But it's, yeah, if you have like 200 people that you source from, then there are bound to be a few rotten apples in those, right? Mm-hmm. But that's, I think, where some of this testing and some of the quality control could come in to kind of either get those producers to change, or not work any longer with those producers. So, but yeah, we've seen that too in our grass-fed beef work, where we got meat from a big company, and some of it of their grass-fed beef looks great from some of their farms. From some of the other farms, I'm thinking like, oh, these guys are feeding grain, and I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but the data definitely suggests this. So,
is there are there any resources that you would point people to if they were looking to learn a little bit more about these areas of nutrition and where like agriculture kind of overlap?
Yeah, so I think some of the group that we're working with is like Understanding Ag. They oftentimes have webinars, a series on that. I really like connecting with them. They're good folks that talk a lot about these things. And I know the green cover seed webinar, I gave some of those with Dale Strickler. He's, you know, also has a good I think perspective on some of those things. So yeah, there's many webinars on YouTube that you can find about that. The tricky part is though, with the internet, it can become a total self-fulfilling prophecy, right? You can go down a rabbit hole where you think that meat is their livestock is the absolute worst thing in the world. You can even convince yourself that the earth is flat, or that 9/11 didn't happen, right? So that's kind of what the internet can do to you. But I'd say what's also important is different perspectives, I think, you know, and I always try to also listen to people with different views than I have, because you can still learn from each other. And I know nowadays in social media, rather Twitter, it's like I don't know if we're really open for it, because I see a lot of mud throwing after each other. But I'd say, you know, learning from different perspectives is absolute key in some of this stuff too. So I would also encourage people to maybe look at things that are maybe not as you know. Yeah, I mean, look at a webinar of like, you know, George Monbiot, who is like, you know, an English climate activist who recently published a new book, and I've read the book, and yeah, of course, I mean, I'm reading it, and I you know, don't agree with a lot of things, but there's, you know, sort of the underlying concern I get. And it's also good to have different perspectives on it. So yeah, that's one of the main things is that I would say. But yeah, I mean, it'd be too easy to say to read my papers, but because I don't have it all figured out either. But you know, yeah, they read some of our work, and I try to give webinars. But you know, even challenge what I say. I certainly don't always get things right, and unfortunately, in the papers, you can't do that like a blog, right? I wish I sometimes could go back into my papers. Jason sense a little bit and add a little nuance or add a butt to this, but yeah, so that's how you learn over time.
Are there any studies that you have going on right now in regards to food and nutrition that you're particularly excited about?
Yeah, we do. And I'm excited about all of them, but we have a major randomized controlled trial going on now. Like major, and I say the major because it's eating up a lot of our time, which is a good thing. We are comparing an agroecological or regenerative diet versus a conventional diet. What that means is that we're feeding 40 people, and it's a crossover design, 7 weeks on each diet, the regenerative diet versus the conventional diet. The conventional diet is just your non-organic produce from the grocery store, typically grown in monocultures, right? Heavy tillage and things like that. Then the regenerative diet, we're sourcing everything from farms that either have integrated crop livestock systems or do some other things to improve plant biodiversity, oftentimes multi-cropping, and even things like our oats. We're sourcing quote unquote regenerative organic certified oats and things like that. But it's 80% produce, meat, eggs, and dairy, which we source from mostly sourced from one farm, the Green Acres farm in Ohio. And what's really nice about those guys is that how they did it, they use lay rotation. So they would grow fruits and vegetables, about 50 or 80 varieties on fields 1 year, have animals graze the other field that year, and then next year they would cross them over. So the animals consume a lot of the waste products, right? And they refertilize the land, they get the animal impact going. And then on those other fields that the animals were on the year before, that's now chock full of nutrients again, right? Because there was animal input, and then they grow the crops on that field. So it's a really nice system in the sense where you don't need a lot of, or requires almost no external inputs, right? You're using animal manure and also green compost, the combination of the two, to refertilize your land, prime your land for next year, to grow crops on it again. And just by using animals and using green compost. So that's really something I'm really excited about, because we have done some food nutrition profiling on that. It's more nutrient dense on paper, that I can feel comfortable saying. One thing we don't know is whether this has an appreciable health effects on humans, right? You often hear like healthy soils equals healthy plants equals healthy animals equals healthy humans. I think I'm starting to feel comfortable saying that healthy soils equals healthy plants equals healthy animals. But the healthy humans part, I'm not sure yet, because there's not a lot of studies or no studies that have been done on that. So the question is that do these more nutrient dense foods also have an appreciable health effects on humans? And we'll see. I mean, we must also be realistic. It's a whole foods based diet. Most of the people that come into the diet are on standard American diet. So everyone's going to get healthier, be my guess, either regardless of which diet they consume. We'll see if there's an additional health benefit on the regenerative diet. And then we're starting another study, grass-fed beef, grain-fed beef, Impossible Burger, a comparison. Also, and this is an acute study looking at, well, we did a profiling of the plant-based meat alternative and grass-fed beef. Very much different metabolites and nutrients in there. Well, if we feed people that, in the hours afterwards, do we see differences in what circulates in their blood, right? Because we've done studies in the past. You can detect amino acids and other nutrients from a food source after 15 minutes in people's blood. So oftentimes we think about like plant-based meat alternatives and meat as sort of nutritionally interchangeable, but based on their nutrition profiles, they're not. If you profile really well, do we see that in sort of also the compounds that circulate in the blood afterwards? Are those different compounds? I mean, my guess would be that they are, but that's our hypothesis. We'll see what the data says. But yeah, that will be interesting to look at. And we're also looking at very short-term inflammatory markers. And then, we have this huge beef nutrient density project going on. We're still looking for farmers. So just Google beef nutrient density project and Bionutrient Institute. That's where some information can be found. And if you're listening to this and you are a farmer and you have a beef operation and you want to get involved in the project, then absolutely shoot us an email about that. And other than that, we'll see what else comes our way. But we have plenty of time with it's fun because I get to do work with farmers directly, and I always learn so much from farmers. Those are also my most relaxing days, because I'm out of the lab for a little bit, right, and see things in perspective again. And then also we do a lot of randomized controlled trials, and then we do a lot of food nutrient density profiling. So we're really trying to do systems work, do more sustainable agricultural practices, also produce healthier foods. And that's sort of the main interest in our lab at the moment.
Are you accepting any applicants for the Impossible Burger tasting? I think Brett might want to sign up.
Yeah, we are. If you want to swing by and spend a few days here, and then you'll. We don't tell you which one it is. We ask you to guess though, and I think you can guess which one is the plant-based meat alternative. But yeah, we ask. We do various questionnaires about your satiety, flavor, and things like that. How do you feel? And then, yeah.
That first study sounds particularly interesting. I'm curious what you guys find out in terms of mineral deficiencies, because I feel like that's something that's not spoken about nearly enough, but it seems very prevalent in the human. Most people are struggling with that sort of deficiency. I think I read in a book that you were actually quoted in a bunch, the plant-based con, like 1 in 3 people are deficient in 10 or more minerals, which just seems astronomical.
Yeah, that seems high to me. Maybe if it's a global number, but indeed, if you look at there was an interesting study that came out in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, and it looked at, I think, like 50 nutrients or so. Yeah, and in low and middle income countries, yeah, it's like a country like India. If you look at like 50 nutrients, it's like 80%, 90% of the population is deficient in like these many of these, or Bangladesh or other. In the US, it's typically a little bit lower. I don't know if we call it deficiencies. You could call it maybe more insufficient intake. We do have an insufficient intake in many vitamins and minerals, and it's especially concerning in children, women of reproductive age, and the elderly, right? And that's where these are key growth stages of life, or where you're making new life, right? And also in elderly is that where you see some of these deficiencies occur. Not to say that it means you and I, as maybe I'm now of middle age, who knows, I'm 35, but middle-aged men like myself do not benefit from eating a very nutrient-dense diet, because obviously then hopefully we won't see these issues with our physical health and our mental health later on, right? So it's good, I think, to ingest a very nutrient-dense diet throughout life. But yeah, it certainly is concerning to see a lot of these nutrient deficiencies pop up that seem to have been growing over time, especially in high income countries like the US and the UK, which in part I think it's probably explained by our high intakes of ultra processed foods, which are just less nutrient dense, and I think that's where we're running a lot of into a lot of issues here. And I think if there's in the whole discussion of plants, meat, I think we're kind of like sort of missing the boat on that. I think a bigger concern also in that regard is our extremely high intake of ultra processed foods, which plant or animal is problematic, which are rising. I mean, study in JAMA that came out last year, 70% of children between 12 and 18 years old, or 70% of their calories come from ultra processed foods. And yeah, that just blows my mind, right? And then we're worried if you ate 6 ounces, or like, I don't know, 6 ounces high, but like 3 ounces of red meat a day, and I'm like,
yes,
maybe we are barking up the wrong tree sometimes, right? Yes. And that's also the case that you find in the studies. Overall diet quality is what matters. That's also why it's almost so frustrating when we link these single foods to human health outcomes. Is that if I eat red meat as part of a Mediterranean diet or Standard American diet, day and night difference in my health outcomes, and eating almonds as part of a Standard American diet, or walnuts, right? It's like, we're not going to get really healthier, right? It's overall diet quality that matters, but yet we are oftentimes linking these single foods to human health outcomes and sort of marketing them as such. And we really have to look at dietary patterns, because that's what matters most. And hopefully, and I see the nutrition field moving more towards in that area, and I think that's a good thing. But yeah, I mean, I can also understand the incentive, because if you're selling a certain food, then you kind of hope that that particular food is the superfood. But sure enough, there's no things as such as a superfood, right? That's a ridiculous statement.
Well, it seems like a lot of the work you're doing is paving the way towards unraveling some of these nutritional mysteries or new age interesting topics around nutrition. So we're excited to see those results, and really glad that you came on to share some of this information with our audience, because it's really important. It's very nuanced, but I think it's really important for people to hear. So, thank you for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, guys. It was my pleasure.
Thanks. Harry will see you at the plant-based study. He'll be the first one in line for the Impossible Burger. So make sure you have a couple ready. Okay.
Perfect. No, you're good. Yeah, and then you'll have to see if you can detect which one it is. No, I can't. Yeah. I don't know. Did you guys ever consume a plant-based meat alternative or not?
I've never had it.
I have not. No.
You can taste it. Like, we were doing this profiling study with the Impossible Burger and grass-fed beef, and it's like, it's I thought it's super impressive from an engineering standpoint, because it kind of bleeds the Impossible Burger. It kind of, it has like the sizzling, but yeah, the moment you sink your teeth in that thing, it's like, oh yeah, this is not beef.
That's
no.
I feel like I should try it, given how much I kind of troll on Beyond Beef.
Yeah, now I must say, last Thanksgiving we have some friends that are vegan, and they made a lasagna with the Impossible Burger, and I could not taste it.
Wow.
Mixed dish. They could have said it was beef, and I would have believed them. So yeah, but yeah, it's a shame that a lot of these things are being brought as sort of like silver bullets for but it seems like it's kind of stagnating, right? The growth of the plant-based meat alternatives.
Yeah, it does seem like they're not growing in nearly as much popularity, and even like a simple Google Trends search, you can see that people seem less interested in it. So it's yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that it's a shame that we can't just provide more real food for people, but hopefully we're steering the ship in the right direction.
Yeah, I think that's that, and ultimately the consumer will decide. And I cannot help but thinking that as omnivores, people like to sometimes portray it as like, oh, we have a choice, but I don't know if it implies we have a choice. I think it means that we can have benefits from both, right? And yeah, sure, you can live on a exclusive vegan diet. For a lot of people, that might not be optimal, right? And I think that's important to note. And yeah, and that's also super interesting to follow the carnivore movement too. Do you guys consume any plant foods or not? Or sometimes?
Some, but very, very little these days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead, man.
No, I was going to say, to your point, food journaling has been big for both of us, particularly when I was making my recovery. And I just found like a lot of the cruciferous vegetables didn't sit well, but then things like potatoes and sweet potatoes sat fine. So I feel like I have days where I will be strict carnivore, and then I'll have days where I'll mix in fruit and raw dairy and some potatoes. It really just depends. And then just because my stomach gets more sensitive, if I ever get sensitive, like the red meat, eggs, and bone broth, that's kind of like what gets me back to my baseline. So I just incorporate that when I need to.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, I'm the same way. If I eat broccoli, then I pay the price the next morning right away. So I just don't eat broccoli or Brussels sprouts, right? Because I just can't digest them. Same with like if I eat a bunch of legumes, I can do that once, like a chili with some beans in it. But if I do that 3 days in a row, then it's lights out. Yeah. So it makes sense. So it's kind of like feeling what's good for you and what works for you. Indeed, like ultimately, if you're not feeling well and consuming plant foods, then yeah, I mean, like who can argue about that, right? So, and the same with the other way around, sort of like, if people are great on doing great on vegan diets, then that's completely fine. Where I think it becomes tricky is that when then people take their own experiences and sort of try to dictate how global population should eat or how everyone should eat. Right?
Yes.
That's really where I think things become iffy. And but yeah, that's another topic, whether we should be consuming, like, yeah, the idea of like a global dietary pattern is
right.
I don't see it working, but
that's like one of our core principles is just this idea of self-experimentation and trying to build your own intuition and barometer around foods that you can interact with and foods that you can't. Because Brett's telling me that he can't eat certain foods, but I'm like, I've never had a problem with those. So maybe we just have different, our bodies have different way of interpreting whatever those foods are. So.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And it's ultimately just, doing what you feel good on. But yeah, I mean, there's tremendous variation amongst people. We know that. That's why the idea of like a one size fits all is ridiculous, right? And that's why it's also, of course, a Mediterranean diet is healthy, but a traditional Okinawan diet is healthy too. A traditional Finnish diet is too. A traditional American diet is too. I mean,
right.
We like recommending a Mediterranean diet to people in the US seems like, yeah. I mean, if you want to eat a Mediterranean diet, it's fine, but it's like I wish, it's also kind of ridiculous on one end, right?
Right.
To think that we should then all be consuming a Mediterranean diet or something like that. So I think that's the case. But yeah, nutrition science has the tendency to fall into dogma. That's sort of the case because everyone eats, right? So everyone has sort of an opinion. I have my partner is in engineering, and I always ask her like, "Oh, do you get debunked in engineering all the time too, or is it just are people getting after each other's throat?" And she's like, "No, that's not a thing in our field." But so it comes with the territory, I guess.
Well, it seems like you've done an amazing job of staying away from the dogma. And like you've mentioned this multiple times, like being willing to challenge yourself or speak to other people that think differently than you. That's so important, especially now. And we've said, even with this podcast too, that like, we want to have members of the plant-based community on to have those discussions, because that's how you actually challenge your beliefs and figure out, am I actually thinking about the right thing or not?
Yeah, no, I think that's important. And, but yeah, don't get me wrong, I get the occasional nasty DM too. People, I hope I get a contract a very bad disease, but yeah, I mean, here's the thing: it's like I'm always happy to engage with people as long as it's done in a respectful and genuine way, right?
Right.
And if it's not to sort of make you look like a fool or trying to debunk you, just because it's based on sort of preconceived notions, right? And the thing though is that you can make a case for anything, right? Like it's sort of interesting. Like I always wanted to do it, I haven't had the time, and it'd probably be a ridiculous undertaking. Is that to write a paper about how bad red meat is, write a paper about how good red meat is, send them in to different journals around the same time, and then because I think you could write a paper touting the benefits or the dangers of red meat, 250 references, and get in equally good journals too, right? And so
you let us know if you want to run with that, and we won't publish this episode, and we'll let you do it anonymously or however you want to do it, because that would be interesting to see. I think you would get traction on both sides.
I think so too. Yeah. Well, I mean, granted, people have done it, right? Different authors, but you can write a paper about we're doing an interesting systematic review now where we're looking at just the simple question: does red meat, when consumed as is red meat associated with metabolic disease when consumed as part of a healthy diet? That's it. We're just looking at healthy diets only, and then do we find association or not? I think a lot of it, the issue is we're conflating this with standard American diets, right? And yeah, that's the thing. But that was great talking, guys. I appreciate you having me on. I'm gonna it's 6:40 here, so I'm gonna
No, it was a pleasure, and we really appreciate you taking the time. This was great.
Yeah, no, that sounds
Awesome.
good. Great, you're still recording, so you can even use our shoot the shit at the end. So
yeah, exactly.